The Middle East continues to fracture along religious and ethnic lines like never before. On Monday, the Kurdistan Regional Government, the KRG, based in Erbil, Iraq, is holding an independence referendum. This referendum has many actors in the region, including the United States, extremely worried about what might come afterwards. Joining me to discuss this from Washington, D.C. is Kamran Bokhari. He's the senior analyst at Geopolitical Futures. Now, Kamran, I want to jump right into this. What is your take on what's happening with this independence referendum? What impact will this have on the region?
At a time when the war against ISIS is not over by any stretch of the imagination, yes, we've taken a lot of territory back from them. We have a new problem, which is that the Kurds in Iraq want their own independent state. And the timing of this is very telling. I mean, in terms of what we need to expect moving forward. So you already have Iran heavily involved in Iraq. You have Turkey intensifying its operations in Syria, and you have the Russians in there. There are all sorts of jihadist groups in Syria. The country of Iraq is shattered beyond repair. Three ways: the Kurds and the Sunnis and the Shiites. In many ways, I mean, the Kurds, their move towards secession is informed by this reality. They think that this is probably the best time to try and secede. It's not; the conditions aren't going to get better. But like anything else, you roll the dice, and there are far too many unintended consequences here. Their calculus is that it'll work, but from where I'm sitting and from where we're sitting at Geopolitical Futures, this is going to create far more conflict than we've already seen.
Wow, okay. So I want to jump to maybe the primary driver that drives the economy in the KRG at this point is oil. And my understanding from an article that you've written is that most of that oil is actually sold via pipelines that go out through Turkey. So what is Turkey's relationship to whatever's going to happen here? Because obviously Turkey has a lot of Kurds living within the country, and the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, has been, frankly, from Turkey's perspective, a terrorist organization for decades. So how do you see Turkey interplaying with this, and how do you see oil coming into play here?
So Turkey is caught in a threat/opportunity situation. On one hand, a Kurdistan appearing on its borders, on the other side of where their own Kurds live, isn't good for Turkey. And it happens at the same time that the Kurds in Syria, on the other border with the Arab world that Turkey has, are also vying for self-rule. And what we have is a situation that, all things being equal, is really bad for Turkey. But that's just part of the story. The other part, which is much interesting, is that Turkey has a very tight relationship with the Iraqi Kurds, and it has cultivated this relationship mutually beneficial to both sides over the past decade. And the key thing that to be noted is that Turkey has created a relationship of dependency. In other words, the KRG is economically tied to Turkey. It's 90% of the budget of the KRG comes from oil proceeds. And a good chunk, a good 90 to 95% of that oil goes through Turkey. So the Kurds with this independence move don't want to exactly, precisely anger the Turks. But at the same time, they are telling the Turks, look, you have nothing to worry about because we're not going to threaten your interests. We have worked with you against your own Kurdish separatists, and you have investments in this country, and so we can be partners. Now, that looks really good from Turkey's point of view, but this is so uncertain, this entire landscape. It's not just one Kurdistan that they're looking at. They're worried about the other Kurdistan in Syria. They're worried about what their Kurds, 15 million, the single largest concentration of Kurds in the world, live in Turkey. They're based in Turkey. And so Turkey has both threat and opportunity. In the long run, it seems like the Turks will be able to manage this situation, given that KRG is so heavily dependent upon them for their political economic well-being. But in the short term, Turkey is going to find this a very, very difficult thing to deal with.
Now, I've also heard that part of the concern here is that, let's just say this referendum takes place, and I'm going to assume that it's going to be overwhelmingly in favor of independence. And let's just say they go ahead and form an independent state. Will that not become a magnet for Kurds throughout the region and just exacerbate this problem even further as it pertains to Turkey and obviously Iraq and even, the United States and Russia?
So a couple of things here. Number one, we don't know if the referendum is going to go through even at this 11th hour, because there are lots of statements coming out saying that, yes, it's going to happen. Then there are statements saying that maybe it won't happen. We're still talking about it. There are lots of actors involved: the Americans, the Turks, the Iranians, KRG, the Iraqi central government dominated by the Shiites. So there's a lot of uncertainty. Let's say it does happen. I hate to call a poll because they're very imprecise. It's not an exact science. But if I had to, give a prediction, I'd say, a good simple majority of Kurds are at the very least going to support it. So let's say there's a yes vote, and it's difficult to tell, how big of a margin it'll be. But let's say there's a yes vote. It doesn't automatically mean there's going to be independence. The Kurdistan regional government is not going to become the Republic of Kurdistan the next day. There is a long, drawn-out process which is unclear. The KRG's plans are, once we have these votes, we are in a better bargaining position to talk to Baghdad and negotiate from a position of relative strength. But whether those talks take place, and where do they end, and there's going to be war associated with it, because there are just so many players involved. It's not just the Shiite-dominated government. There's ISIS waiting to take advantage of these tensions and this fault line. The Sunnis are going to see a lot of their lands lost, because the Kurds are not just vying for KRG to become part of their envisioned Republic of Kurdistan. They are trying to siphon away areas that are much south of that into areas that formerly belonged to the Iraqi central government. It's under their jurisdiction. So this is by no stretch of the imagination going to be easy. And so I think we should be cautious in terms of how quickly the Kurds will gain independence. I mean, this is a long struggle, and the referendum is just the beginning.
So at this point then, who do you see as the primary shaper of events going forward?
I think there's no doubt it's Turkey. Turkey because, it's the regional player. It's the largest state in the region. It's the 17th largest economy of the world. It is the regional hegemon. On top of that, as I mentioned earlier, there is a political economic relationship of dependency. The Kurds need Turkey if they're going to have a viable Kurdistan, whether it's extremely autonomous or completely independent, difficult to tell. But whatever shape or form they are exercising self-rule and self-determination, they need Turkey, because they need to export their oil and gas. And Turkey is the only viable way. The other route goes through Baghdad, and there is no way that the Iraqis are going to be doing business, the Shiites or the Sunnis, with the Kurds, especially now that the Kurds are pushing for more autonomy, independence, and taking away more areas. So Turkey has the biggest seat on the table. The other thing is that if Turkey can manage this somehow, it's a huge gain for Turkey in the long run. Why? Because currently Iraq is dominated by Iran, Turkey's regional rival. This situation, if managed well by the Turks, and if they can reach an understanding with the KRG, and there's a meeting of minds, then Turkey has a place to stand in Iraq. Right now, Turkey has very little influence in Iraq. So this is going to be a win situation, but in the long run, and there's a lot that can happen between now and then.
Okay, final question for you then. From an American perspective, what does the Trump administration want?
the Trump administration, basically like any other administration in Washington, would want, as few problems as the Middle East can, given the state of the Middle East. This is just another headache to deal with when there are just so many problems dealing with Iran, dealing with, mediating between the Saudis and the Qataris, dealing with the war against ISIS. Syria is, in flames. Libya is a basket case. There's a war in Yemen. Egypt is not doing well economically. This is the last thing that the United States wants. So it will take any and all help that it can get from Turkey. And even the Iranians. I mean, the Iranians are stakeholders in this, so they're not going to be, sitting on the sidelines. They're going to be heavily involved in the negotiations. So in some ways, regional players like Iran and Turkey stepping up means that the U.S. has to do much less in terms of, the heavy lifting. So that's good. But the overall strategic picture just gets so complicated for the United States.
Well, we'll be waiting to see what happens on Monday. Kamran, thanks so much for your time.
My pleasure.